In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman walked out into the street and began to dance. There was no music. There was no festival. There was no reason. And she did not stop. She danced for days until her feet were bleeding and her body was breaking down. And then, one by one, her neighbors began to join her. Within a month, as many as 400 people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, unable to stop themselves. And some of them danced until they died. This is not a myth, and it is not a legend. It is one of the most well-documented mysteries in all of history, written down by physicians, by city officials, by chroniclers who watched it unfold with their own eyes. And more than 500 years later, we still cannot say for certain why it happened. This is the true story of the dancing plague of 1518. To understand how strange this is, you have to understand the world it happened in. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city in the Holy Roman Empire in the region of Alsace, in what is now eastern France. And it was not a happy place. The years leading up to 1518 had been brutal. There had been failed harvests, terrible famine, and crushing poverty. New and frightening diseases, including syphilis, were spreading through Europe. Outbreaks of plague were a constant fear. For ordinary people, life was hard, hungry, and full of dread, and the church taught that suffering could be a punishment sent from God. This is the backdrop you need to hold in your mind. A population already starving, sick, frightened, and exhausted. And then, into that came the dancing. It began with a single person. According to the records, her name was Frau Trophia. On a July day in 1518, she stepped into a narrow street in Strasbourg and started to dance, silently, with no music playing. At first, people probably laughed or thought she was being foolish. But she kept going. She danced through the afternoon. She danced into the evening. She danced through the night. And when the sun came up, she was still dancing. Witnesses said she went on for somewhere between 4 and 6 days, almost without rest. Her shoes wore through. Her feet were bruised and bloody. Her body was clearly in agony, and still her limbs kept moving as if they no longer belonged to her. This is one of the eeriest details of the whole true story. The people who danced did not look like they were enjoying it. They looked terrified. They looked exhausted. Many of them seemed to be begging for it to stop, even as their own bodies refused to obey. And here is where it stops being one strange woman and starts becoming a plague. Within days, others began to dance too. First a handful, then dozens. By the end of the first week, around 34 people had joined Frau Trophia in the streets. And it kept growing. Over the following weeks, the number swelled to as many as 400 people, all caught in the same uncontrollable dancing. Think about how bizarre that scene must have been. Hundreds of ordinary townspeople, bakers, farmers, mothers, laborers, twitching and spinning and stamping through the streets and squares of a major medieval city, day after day, unable to stop. This was not a celebration. It was a mass affliction, spreading from person to person like a sickness. The authorities of Strasbourg realized they had a serious crisis on their hands, and they turned to the experts of the day for an answer. They called in physicians. And this is where the story takes a turn that, with everything we know now, is almost painful to hear. The doctors examined the situation and ruled out the supernatural. They decided this was not caused by demons or by a curse from God. In the medicine of the time, the body was thought to be governed by 4 fluids called humors, and many illnesses were blamed on an imbalance of them. The physicians concluded that this dancing was caused by what they called hot blood, an overheating of the body. And from that diagnosis came a catastrophic decision. They believed that the only cure was for the afflicted to dance the fever out of their system. In other words, the official medical advice was, let them keep dancing and even help them do it. So that is exactly what the city did. The authorities of Strasbourg did not try to stop the dancers. They tried to encourage them. They cleared out 2 guildhalls and set aside an open-air grain market as spaces for the dancing to continue. They even built a wooden stage. And then they hired musicians, pipers, and drummers to play music to keep the rhythm going. They brought in professional dancers to move alongside the afflicted and keep them company. The idea was that if these people could just dance continuously, they would burn the sickness out and recover. Instead, it appears to have done the opposite. The music and the open spaces seem to have drawn even more people in. More townsfolk began to dance, and the ones already dancing were now being actively kept in motion hour after hour, day after day, with no real rest. A crisis that the city was trying to cure, it may have been feeding instead. And the human cost of that mistake was severe. Remember, these were not athletes. They were undernourished people in the heat of summer, pushed far past the limits of the human body. Dancing for days without proper rest, food, or water does terrible things to a person. According to some accounts from the time, the toll was horrifying. There were reports that at the peak of the plague, around 15 people were dying every day. People collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Others are said to have died from strokes and heart attacks, their hearts simply giving out under the relentless strain. Now, historians debate the exact numbers, and some of the death figures may have been exaggerated by later chroniclers. But the core of it is not in dispute. People danced until their bodies failed, and this dancing killed. A mysterious compulsion had turned the streets of a real city into something out of a nightmare. So what on earth could cause something like this? This is the question that has haunted historians and scientists for centuries, and there are two main theories. The first is poison, specifically a theory involving a fungus called ergot. Ergot grows on damp rye, the grain that medieval Europeans used to make their bread. And ergot is dangerous. It contains compounds chemically related to powerful hallucinogenic drugs. Eating bread made from contaminated rye can cause a condition once known as St. Anthony's fire, with violent convulsions, a burning sensation, and terrifying hallucinations. On the surface, it sounds like a perfect explanation, but there is a serious problem with it. Ergot poisoning typically cuts off blood flow to the limbs, causing intense pain and making it very hard to move or even stand, let alone dance coordinated movements for days on end. The poison that should have crippled them does not easily explain hundreds of people dancing. So many researchers look to a second, stranger explanation. That second theory is mass psychogenic illness, what we more commonly call mass hysteria. The historian John Waller is one of the strongest voices for this idea. His argument goes like this. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were living in extreme, prolonged stress, famine, disease, fear, and deep religious dread. And crucially, this region had an old, powerful belief about a saint named Saint Vitus. According to local legend, Saint Vitus had the power to strike sinners with a curse that forced them to dance uncontrollably. People genuinely, deeply believe this. So the theory is that under unbearable psychological pressure and primed by this terrifying belief, one person, Frau Trophia, slipped into a kind of trance state and began to dance. And because everyone around her already believed that this exact curse was real and could happen, the affliction spread from mind to mind, like an idea catching fire. In a population convinced that a saint could make them dance against their will, the very fear of it may have made it come true. So how did it finally end? As summer wore on, the city's strategy of encouraging the dancing was clearly failing, and the deaths were mounting. So the authorities changed course completely. They stopped the music, banned public dancing, and shut down the spaces they had opened. And then they turned from medicine back to faith. The remaining dancers were gathered up, loaded into wagons, and carried to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, set in a cave in the hills near the town of Savrin. There the afflicted were led before the altar. They were given small wooden crosses, and according to the accounts, red shoes and prayers and rites were performed over them to lift the curse. And whether it was the ritual, the rest, the removal from the crowd, or the affliction simply running its course, it worked. Slowly, the dancing stopped. By around September of 1518, The plague had faded away, and the survivors went home. The streets of Strasbourg were quiet again, and that is what makes the dancing plague of 1518 so unforgettable. This was not a story passed down by superstition. It was recorded in city documents, in physicians' notes, and in the chronicles of people who lived through it. An entire town watched hundreds of its own people dance, helplessly and in terror, some of them to their deaths. And the smartest minds of the age made it worse by telling them to keep going. We have the records, we have the dates, we have the names, and we still cannot fully prove what caused it. Poison in the bread, or a sickness of the mind spreading through a terrified city. The experts still argue today, but the event itself is not in question. In the summer of 1518, hundreds of real people really did dance until they dropped in a real city for reasons no one has ever truly settled. That's real. If this one got under your skin, the like button genuinely helps the channel. And if you want more true stories that should be fiction but aren't, we post every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next.